Hi, I'm Andrew Torres, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 76 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, November 9th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. It is actually our third anniversary. I have absolutely nothing special planned for it, except for a couple of extra Patreon episodes for the subscribers over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. But I do want to extend out a huge thanks to everybody who downloads every week and has for the past 3 years. Thank you so much for keeping us going and for keeping those download numbers up. It's because of you that I do this, and I just thoroughly appreciate you guys listening in for the past 3 years. Thank you so much. Let's get into it. On this episode, we take a look at the avalanche of acts and ordinances that were being passed in Nauvoo to establish some semblance of a real operating city. Joseph Smith and his favorite elites had a lot of work to do, and were in the process of forming new committees and organizations on a daily basis to answer the myriad needs of the burgeoning community. Once again, we find speculation to be the sole ruling factor in the formation of any Nauvoo business or agency. Joe even passed an act dealing with intolerant speech against people of faith. We can't have those atheists building a church in Nauvoo now, can we? After that, we'll get into part 2 of my conversation with Jack and Nanique of the Mormon Awakenings podcast, where we really discuss some hard issues with the church's stances on LGBTQ+ people and the value that churches give society in general. Patreon subscribers, be sure to check your patreon.com feed. There's an exciting announcement with Ryan McKnight as a separate episode over there, and patrons of the show get to hear it a week earlier than everybody else does. Also, you can listen to the Namo Home Evening that we had with John and Logus from the Wayward Willis podcast, as well as Thomas Smith, and David Michael even popped in for a little while. So that was a jam-packed full podcasting celebrity episode, and of course Patreon subscribers get access to that. So let's jump into the episode. For just a little bit of milk for today, let's review where we sit in the timeline. Basically, we're in the foundational days of Nauvoo, Illinois. There was so much work to be done in order to establish it as a Mormon utopia envisioned by the prophet and his favorite elites. John C. Reckitt Bennett was elected mayor of Nauvoo, and he's pretty much been running the place as a dictator, giving tasks to Joe and other trusted Mormon elites where situations dictate it to carry out any task necessary to build up the kingdom on the Mississippi. And here's actually just a little side note here. I have to say thank you to the unnamed sender who sent me a copy of Robert Flanders' book. It was a very kind gift, and you can see a picture of me with it on the Naked Mormonism Facebook page. That was right after I opened it up, and I was so surprised to see it. So once again, thank you, whoever you are, for sending that book to me. Back to it, John and Bennett were creating a bunch of new committees and organizations throughout the last few episodes, which they hoped would make Nauvoo a real town with a thriving economy. That was the hope. We'll see how this plays out in the coming years leading up to the removal of the Saints from Nauvoo. That's enough for milk. Let's devour some meat and see what new projects Joe picked up through the rest of February and March of 1841.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
By mid-February 1841, where we currently reside in our timeline, Nauvoo was becoming too populous and cumbersome to deal with as a single entity. In response to the challenging logistics this posed, Joe and John Reckitt Bennett responded by subdividing the city into separate wards. Yeah, wards. Mormons today will recognize the word ward as being the terminology used for churches today. For any Nevermo listeners out there who aren't familiar with the Mormonese, in any given area there's usually a ward house or a stake center, and the local population around that church is divided up into multiple wards based on the geography and the income of the neighborhood and population statistics, a few other factors. This is the first time the word ward was used in early church history. Prior to this, congregations were just referred to as stakes of Zion, like how you stake a tent. These congregations were seen as groups which all, supported the main contingency of Mormons at Zion. That was the headquarters, wherever that was at the time. But Zion was the tent and the other congregations were the stakes holding it down. With Nauvoo growing at the rate that it was, and requiring so much infrastructure to support the population, it was divided into 4 separate wards, surveyed and sanctioned by the prophet himself. The history of the church has the entire ordinance, and I'm going to spare you reading it because it's really meaningless. It just dictates out the specific streets and measurements of what the wards are. But it is important to note that Joe immediately passed another ordinance creating new positions inside the Nauvoo government to help deal with this fracturing of the city into separate wards. This is the ordinance, quote, "Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that in addition to the city officers heretofore elected, there shall be elected by the City Council 1 high constable for each ward, 1 surveyor and engineer, 1 market master, 1 weigher and sealer, and 1 collector for the city, whose duties shall hereafter be defined by ordinance." End quote. By separating Nauvoo out into 4 separate wards, Joe decided to create a couple of committees and incorporate a business venture or two. The first he sought to create wasn't just a committee, but an entire association which Nauvoo desperately needed. Quote, "An act to incorporate the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association in the county of Hancock." We're going to read just a few sections out of this, but this is important. This is incorporating and creating the Agricultural and Manufacturing Association for the city of Nauvoo. And Section 2 says, "The sole object and purpose of said association shall be for the promotion of agriculture and husbandry in all its branches, and for the manufacture of flour, lumber, and other such useful articles as are necessary for the ordinary purposes of life." Section 3 says, "The capital stock of said association," of course, stock, they're talking stock already, "shall be $100,000. What capital are they creating this with? They didn't have $100,000 of capital to throw into this to create the association. They just said that it has stock. Very interesting. Anyway, with the privilege of increasing to the sum of $300,000, of course, to be divided into shares of $50, which shall be considered personal property and be assignable in such manner as the said corporation may, by its bylaws, provide." Of course, so this is a government agency, basically. It's the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association. Essentially, it's an act that is passing this and creating this association, but it's being created as a company with stock, subdivided and given to the stockholders. I find that interesting. And it doesn't seem like this is a really good idea. The last time I checked, the taxpayers are stockholders in government agencies, but they aren't actually divvied out stock the way that a for-profit, capitalistic business is. So this doesn't seem like it's a very good idea. Section 5 says, "Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and William Law shall be commissioners to receive subscriptions for and distribute said capital stock for said corporation." End quote. So this was basically Joe and 20 of his friends creating another business venture in the form of this Ag and Manufacturing Association. And they, of course, had to, in the act of incorporation, set the price of the stock in the business. But this wasn't already a profitable business which could be successfully divided up. It was just a business that they made up on paper and then sold stock shares in. Now, this association may have served some kind of real purpose, but let's not take the noble-sounding government title of this association at just face value. This was just one more company made up so that the Mormons could speculate on it in hopes of, making money But the first section of this act did list the 20 people who were named the trustees, and they paid in stock for being able to serve on the board of the association. But the thing is, you're supposed to have capital in a company before you trade it around and speculate on its stock. But all of these companies were missing that crucial part of their investing. Real capital. None of them actually had capital to invest. The Mormons didn't have money to invest into these business ventures. I'll just add this into the mix. Governor Thomas Carlin, as well as the speakers of the state Senate and House of Representatives, signed this act creating the association. Really, they were probably aware of what the Mormons were doing in creating these businesses, but the thing is, I assume that these government officials, just like the Mormons, had some kind of blind optimism in hopes that Nauvoo would pan out, and eventually the capital and manufacturing of the city would match the need for all of these committees and associations. And eventually, it seems like they were creating these companies with the hopes that somehow one day they would be profitable and that the capital would actually match the stock that they had subdivided the hypothetical capital up to. But we can't forget this detail. They were all overseen by that same group of Mormon elites who were continually spreading themselves ever thinner. So you have 20 people, 30, 40 people who are running a bunch of different organizations and chairing on all of these boards, and eventually they just become completely powerless to get any actual work done with these. So the next act that was passed was an act to incorporate the Nauvoo House Association. And we've discussed the Nauvoo House a little bit in the past couple of episodes, so we're not going to rehash it, but needless to say, this was just another company that was created on paper with tradable stock without having real capital to throw around. Joe and friends apparently hadn't learned from the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company, and they were just creating another bubble inside the Nauvoo economy at its very foundation. And creating business ventures damned upon their creation wasn't the only thing that Joe was doing wrong here. This was one of his most active times in church history when it came to documentable day-to-day activities. He was constantly bringing up these acts and reports and these ordinances. It seems like it was every other day that he was presenting the Nauvoo City Council or the Nauvoo government with all of these acts and reports. And the officials passed it. Anything that Joe brought to them, it was just rubber stamped through the committee because, well, he's the prophet, right? His followers aren't going to oppose legislation and business ventures that he brings to them. So Joe actually ended up taking a page out of the American playbook when it came to territory. And the thing is, the way I had always understood Nauvoo history was that the Saints initially began settling in Commerce, Illinois. Then once the Nauvoo Charter was passed, Commerce just turned into Nauvoo. That was inaccurate, and the history of the church sheds a little bit of light on this subject. Basically, Commerce still existed as an incorporated township, but Nauvoo was kind of overlaid on top of it, with some of the outerlying areas still being part of Commerce. But Nauvoo was in line to absorb any nearby town into its boundaries, which is what happened to Commerce, and this is the act that Joseph passed. Quote, "Your committee, to whom was referred that portion of the address of his honor, the mayor, which has recommended the propriety of vacating the town plots Commerce and the city of Commerce and incorporating them with the city plat of Nauvoo, would respectfully report that they consider the recommendation contained in the address as one of great importance to the future welfare and prosperity of this city, and if carried into effect would make the streets regular and uniform, and materially tend to beautify the city. We would therefore respectfully recommend that the survey of the city of Nauvoo be carried through the town plats of Commerce and the city of Commerce as soon as it may be practicable. We would therefore recommend to the council the passage of the following resolution, that the town plats of Commerce and Commerce City be vacated, and that the same stand vacated from this time forth and forever, and that the same be incorporated with the city of Nauvoo from this time henceforth and forever." End quote. And this ordinance passed. Basically, Joseph effectively dissolved Commerce, Illinois, and then annexed the land into the township of Nauvoo. And this is really not surprising. When there is a township or a population and another population comes in that grows to be bigger, eventually it's probably going to consume the smaller population and absorb or annex it into their town plat. And that's what happened with Nauvoo and Commerce. So I was inaccurate. I didn't understand how, what happened to Commerce once Nauvoo was created. I thought that they were just one and the same. Turns out Commerce was still a city when Nauvoo was a city and the Nauvoo Charter was passed, but Joseph ordered that the town of Commerce be vacated and everything dissolved and just become absorbed into the town of Nauvoo. So with this ordinance, Nauvoo was placed kind of on top of Commerce, but there wasn't any actual city infrastructure for Nauvoo to absorb in Commerce because Commerce was just basically empty acreage with a few houses on it. The thing is, Joe was a product of his time. When there's a bunch of land without anybody or very few people on it, we'll just call it part of our bigger civilization and assume control over the land. We European settlers had made quite a habit of doing this to American soil with First Nation tribes. Joe thought that it was a good idea to emulate even more aspects of American law, above and beyond just Jackson's control of appropriating land. And the Founding Fathers had trotted out their arguments for what should and shouldn't be included in the American Constitution. That happened 54 years before Nauvoo was incorporated as a city, and the Founding Fathers made good cases for why certain provisions like free speech and right to assembly should be enshrined in the Constitution, and Joe sought to follow their example in more ways than one. It's continuing from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4. This is beginning on page 300. Quote, Section 1, be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that in order to guarantee the constitutional right of free discussion upon all subjects, the citizens of this city may from time to time peaceably assemble themselves together for all peaceable or lawful purposes whatever, and should any person be guilty of disturbing or interrupting any such meeting or assemblage, he shall, on conviction thereof before the mayor or municipal court, be considered a disturber of the public peace and fined in any sum not exceeding $500, or imprisoned not exceeding 6 months, or both, at the discretion of said mayor or court. Section 2. Should any person be guilty of exciting the people to riot or rebellion, or of participating in a mob or any other unlawful, riotous, or tumultuous assemblage of the people, or of refusing to obey any civil officer executing the ordinances of the city or the general laws of the state of the United States, or of neglecting or refusing to obey promptly any military order for the due execution of said law or ordinances, he shall, on conviction thereof as aforesaid, be fined or imprisoned, or both as aforesaid. Okay, end quote. That was a lot of, it seems like gobbledygook, but this is really important. Basically, Joseph enshrined in this ordinance that the city of Nauvoo is going to allow for peaceable assemblies to happen. That's part of the Constitution, having the right to assembly and free speech. But it also says that if anybody is guilty of disturbing or interrupting any of these meetings or assemblies, that person can be fined or thrown in jail for 6 months. And if a person is guilty of exciting people to riot or rebellion, we know how that came into play against the church or against Joseph Smith, then they can be fined or imprisoned as well. So we have the Mormon government in Nauvoo setting up this monolithic system of government, essentially, and allowing certain provisions from the Constitution to make it into ordinances of the city of Nauvoo, like assemblage and free speech. But they're writing in their own protections for their own religion here. And because Joseph gathered people in massive, swaths all of the time in Nauvoo, whether it was for some, anniversary or for some ceremony or the temple dedication, whatever, he gathered hundreds and sometimes thousands of people in parades and in, big parties and whatnot. They weren't riots, it wasn't considered tumultuous assemblage, but there were good reasons for Joseph to include this. And he also created the protection that if there's anybody who is opposed to the peaceful assemblies that are happening, of the Mormons, then they can be taken out. They can be taken and fined and possibly thrown in jail. This was a good provision for the Mormons to be written into law. The Mormons were a large congregation of people. They wanted the right to assemble without raising the attention of or offending any mob or militia force, especially the occasional Missouri militia or militiaman who would just wander into town trying to serve arrest warrants on the prophet. Also, the Mormons were people, and people, when people aren't happy with stuff, they get out of their homes and they get in groups with pitchforks and torches and they yell about whatever grieves them. So they didn't have TV to satiate the boredom. So really, this is probably a good idea to create this act incorporating this free assemblage into the city of Nauvoo. But we can also see how it may be used to inordinately protect Mormons and probably not any other group, because it was almost a strictly Mormon population. Now we get into something that I find pretty interesting. And in order to qualify this and really talk about it, I have to take quite a few steps back, like more than 150 years back, basically. The first American blasphemy law that I could find on record came out of His Majesty's province of the Massachusetts Bay in 1697. And this is this blasphemy law enshrined into American law before it was actually the United States. It was just a province of England. Quote, "An act against atheism and blasphemy. Be it declared and enacted by the Lieutenant Governor, Council, and Representatives convened in General Court or Assembly, and it is enacted by the authority of the same, that if any person shall presume willfully to blaspheme the holy name of God, Father, Son, or Holy Ghost, either by denying, cursing, or reproaching the true God, his creation or government of the world, or by denying, cursing, or reproaching the holy word of God," that is, the canonical scriptures contained in the books of the Old and New Testaments, and then it actually lists out all of the Bible books without the Apocrypha for some reason. So that's what it's saying. People blaspheming, talking against God, Jesus, the Bible. Everyone so offending shall be punished by imprisonment not exceeding 6 months, and until they find sureties for the good behavior, by sitting in the pillory, by whipping, boring through the tongue with a red-hot iron, or sitting upon the gallows with a rope about the neck, at the discretion of the court of assize and general gaol delivery, before which the trial shall be, according to the circumstances which may aggravate or alleviate the offense. Okay, that's and it adds one more provision. Provided that no more than 2 of the forementioned punishments shall be inflicted for one and the same fact. End quote. So basically, this is the first blasphemy law that I could find. And it just says anybody who is denying the existence of God or who is willfully blaspheming the holy name of God can be punished by imprisonment of 6 months, by sitting in the pillory, by whipping, or by boring a red-hot iron through their tongue, or by sitting on the gallows with a rope about their neck. And all of these things are decided at the discretion of the court. So that's some early stuff. But think about this. This is not quite 150 years before Nauvoo was incorporated as a city in 1841, so there really wasn't a large swath of time in between these two. And okay, and this was also 1697, right? That's when this was passed, and it came right off of the heels of the Salem witch trials and executions. Those had happened less than half a decade prior to this law being passed. Of course, this happened before almost all of the laudable founding fathers were born, and America was declared as a secular nation. So let's look at laws passed after America became the United States to get a bit more context, because, what the colonies did before they were the United States, that doesn't seem to impact the history quite as much as what is enshrined in the Constitution and laws afterwards. A Maryland statute was the first of these, and it was created in 1723. Now, granted, that was still before the Declaration of Independence, but this was enshrined as a law in 1819. And, that's worth taking note of. And this law says, quote, "If any person by writing or speaking shall blaspheme or curse God, or shall write or utter any profane words of and concerning our Savior Jesus Christ, or of and concerning the Trinity, or any of the persons thereof, he shall on conviction be fined not more than $100, or imprisoned not more than 6 months. or both fined and imprisoned as aforesaid at the discretion of the court." End quote. What's interesting here is that this and most similar blasphemy laws are really limited in scope, in that they only protect Christianity. But they could actually be interpreted pretty broadly. So, for example, a person could hand out pamphlets all day that said Allah is a false god and Muhammad is a false prophet, clearly blasphemous to the, what they called Mohammedans back then. But nobody would bother the person for saying that. But as soon as somebody living in the state with a blasphemy law said that the Bible isn't true or that the God of the Old or New Testament isn't a real God, it was off to the courthouse with that person, and that frequently resulted in fines or jail time. But, like I said, this could be interpreted pretty broadly. Everything from standing on a corner and shouting that God is dead, to distributing pamphlets, to just in polite conversation with somebody between a theist and an atheist, somebody overheard that, the person could be carted off. So there really were no protections for people without religious belief back then. So in the 1800s, it wasn't considered a violation of church and state separation or free speech to have blasphemy laws. And many states still have impotent blasphemy laws on their books, even to this day. But, of course, thanks to a small handful of rulings, jurisprudence has completely neutered any of these blasphemy laws, so they only take up paper and ink and do nothing for anybody. But that's a luxury of our modern times. It wouldn't be until the early 1900s that rulings came out of various Supreme Courts which nullified these blasphemy laws. In 1928, there was a man named Charles Lee Smith who began handing out pamphlets promoting atheism and evolution in Arkansas. He was charged with blasphemy and ended up refusing to swear oath in court on the Bible, so the court refused to let him testify on his own behalf. The judge in that case ended up withdrawing the charge of blasphemy, for which Lee was originally convicted, and then slapped him with a charge of distributing obscene, slanderous, or scurrilous literature. That charge stuck, and Lee ended up having to pay the fine, and he served jail time for distributing what was basically the legal equivalent of porn for free to minors. Let's not mince words about Charles Lee Smith, though. He was a product of his time. He was born in 1887, and he was totally on board with eugenics and the white master race. He held that evolution was an immutable truth, and as a pseudo-logical step, he thought that whites were the superior race. But he was an early atheist activist. We can appreciate the actions that he's taken in moving society forward, even if he held some deplorable and ignorant beliefs. Charles Lee Smith is a great example of somebody that we can commend for good actions, but condemn for holding certain bigoted beliefs. But the reason it's kind of relevant to discuss some of the history of blasphemy laws in America is to shed some light on the legal atmosphere from which the Nauvoo city laws and ordinances were derived. Joe passed another ordinance. This one is titled, quote, "An Ordinance in Relation to Religious Societies." Quote, "Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Latter-day Saints, Quakers, Episcopalians, Universalists, Unitarians, Mohammedans, and all other religious sects and denominations whatever shall have free toleration and equal privileges in this city. And should any person be guilty of ridiculing and abusing or otherwise depreciating another in consequence of his religion, or of disturbing or interrupting any religious meeting within the limits of this city, he shall, on conviction thereof before the mayor or municipal court, be considered a disturber of the public peace and fined in any sum not exceeding $500 or imprisoned not exceeding 6 months, or both at the discretion of said mayor or court." End quote. So that was basically the blasphemy law. Okay, that was the Nauvoo blasphemy law. You can have a religion, but if you speak out against religions, you're going to jail or you're going to be fined. The second section of this same act it actually puts the teeth in it. And it says that anybody seen ridiculing a person based on their religion should be immediately arrested and dealt with according to this ordinance. So I guess it's just worth pointing out that Joseph Smith really was a product of his time. And, his writings and the ordinances and laws that were being passed through Nauvoo, they were just a product of the political and legal climate of 19th century America. And they enshrined many of the things that we consider, bigoted in some way into law back then. And it didn't just hit in Nauvoo when Joseph was, creating all of these ordinances and associations and whatnot. You can read through the Book of Mormon, and the occasional atheist is going to pop up and have an argument with the prophet, Korah, whatever. Atheists were surprisingly common back in the 19th century America. And this is something interesting. Joseph probably attended one of these debates between an atheist and a theist at some point in Rochester or in a local township or something to that effect. Or he just saw people talking on the streets, atheist to theist and whatnot. These conversations were happening all over. You can find newspaper articles all over the place talking about and reporting on an atheist and theist conversations that are happening. And I actually found an article in the Evening Post, and this was published in New York, March of 1822. And it seems to bring up some interesting points. Quote, "It is said that attempts are making to produce a political effect upon the community by the agitation of the question touching the decision of the Supreme Court in regard to the admissibility or exclusion of witnesses on the ground of their religious faith. This very question was a subject of consideration in our late convention, and on a motion made by General Root, this is the motion, that no witness shall be questioned as to his religious faith," end quote. So that was the motion. That they're trying to pass, that somebody who's up on court shouldn't be questioned based on their religious faith. And this is what somebody replied to General Root's motion. Colonel Young said, quote, "If by religious faith were meant a belief in a supreme being and in future rewards and punishments, he should oppose it. The testimony of an atheist and infidel ought not to be placed upon an equality with others, as he could feel no responsibility." The question on the motion of General Root was then taken by ayes and noes and decided in the negative, ayes 8 and noes 94, end quote. So I have to qualify what I just read through. Basically, they were having an argument in this, this was a reprint from a Massachusetts article. They were having this argument between General Root and Colonel Young. General Root said nobody should be questioned on the witness stand about their religious faith. Then Colonel Young said, we can't take the testimony of an atheist and an infidel at the same level of equality as people with religious belief because they can feel no responsibility. Basically, if you swear on the Bible and you're an atheist, then, you don't actually fear hellfire for perjury. So we can't trust those testimonies. I guess this completely ignores that age-old tenet of religious belief that sometimes it's better to lie for the Lord. But the thing is this motion against General Root brought up, he wanted the motion to pass that people can't be questioned on the stand based on their religious belief. There were only 8 votes for that, whereas there were 94 votes against it. So it was the perspective of the general populace that atheists were not considered trustworthy. Atheists and infidels, their testimony was not considered trustworthy in the court of law. And this is actually a pretty common way that atheists were treated in the 19th century. Their testimonies weren't taken as truthful in court, and when they would pass out pamphlets and whatnot saying that God isn't real, or they would preach on a public corner or something, they were seen as disturbers of the peace, and they often suffered fines or jail time for preaching atheism. This ordinance that Joe wrote in Nauvoo law was obviously a product of its time. All religions enjoyed a protection, but somebody without a religion could be fined or thrown into prison just for voicing their opinions, should they be deemed a disturber of the peace by the government or by the Nauvoo Legion, whatever. It's interesting to note that the Mormons created all of these legal protections for their own assemblies and for their own preaching, but as soon as somebody comes along who is preaching against them, let's just throw them in jail. Let's fine them $500. It's just baffling to see this the way that government was seen and created back then. I guess this brings me to a question. Are we somehow past all of this? The main reason I find history to be so interesting and compelling is it informs us of how we got to where we are today. And I get so frustrated hearing arguments that because we had the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Movement, that we've somehow left it all behind us and we're enlightened beyond the constraints of our ignorant past. No, we're still a product of our society, and we still operate within the margins of tolerance dictated by the world we leave behind when we wake up every morning. Society has solved so many issues which used to hold us back, but it's an upward trend that needs active attention to continue towards the goal of total equality. There will be blips where equality dips on our way up to, total equality, but society is a hell of a lot more equal today than it was in Joseph Smith's day. Back then, they didn't accept an atheist's testimony in court because an atheist doesn't have morals and you can't trust somebody if they don't swear over the Bible. In Joe's day, women's say in politics was nothing more than them raising good men who would one day grow up and vote in their own mother's best interests. When Joseph was alive, people owned other people as farm implements, as a person owns a windrower today. That's where America was 5 generations ago. Is that as baffling to you as it is to me? 5 generations. And really, seeing these trends and seeing the angels of our better nature, I have to say that I'm optimistic to see how far we've come, and I'm hopeful to see where we're going. But there will be blips. We have to stay ever vigilant when it comes to advocating for equality. We can't let society slip backwards due to our own apathy. What you're about to listen to is part 2 of my interview with Jack Nanique. When we last left off with Jack, he and I were discussing whether or not it's a worthwhile endeavor to seek validation from the church and a person's community when that church and community don't agree with the person's lifestyle. So, just a little bit of a primer so you can pick up where we left off last week. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Jack Nanique. But I do want to explore a little bit of why people do seek this validation. Because I think that, by and large, when people are seeking validation, they are doing so because they feel invalid in some way. When somebody is a member of when somebody is, let's say, gay, and the church says, you can't be a member of this church, or your kids can't be a member of this church if you're in a gay relationship rearing these children, they feel, it's understandable that they could feel like the church is casting aspersions at their lifestyle, where the church shouldn't have a place in saying what is and is not an okay family life to raise children in. And when people see that this church is, causing divides in their family and causing divides in their community because this church is built out of small communities, I think that it is good on them to seek validation from the church for who they are, for what they are, and not try and change themselves in order to attain that validation.
Oh, I agree. I agree. I mean, they shouldn't try to change themselves to achieve the validation. I agree with that part. But all I was trying to say is, they may or may not get it from the church in their lifetimes. And why beat your... I guess the more, as you seek validation from a group or an entity that may or may not ever give it to you, I think along that path, at some point you realize, this whole validation pursuit, the point of it is to teach me that I'm the source of my own validation.
But that's not good enough for many people who lose their family members in the interim period until the church does agree with people living their life how they choose. They are losing their jobs. They are losing their family members. They're losing their friends when they come out as gay. They are kicked out of their parents' houses when they come out as gay. They suffer so much turmoil and tribulation because of the church's stance on something. And I can understand that when somebody is exiled from a community, they may harbor some grudges against that community or against that church and want to call it out for where they see faults in it. And I don't think we should conflate seeking validation with calling out faults. I think that those may be two sides of the same coin. If you're seeking validation for how you live your life, you can be doing that by saying that the church is wrong in some aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people will feel, compelled to do that. I guess, I think they do get conflated, and I think it's important to keep them separate. And again, I think calling out things that one feels are unjust or bigoted or discriminatory, oppressive. I mean, people should do that. People have a right to do that, and that's a good thing. And some people have a lot of energy and a personality and the proclivity to do those things, and those are great. The only distinction and I think I'm going to say it again just to be clear, but I think we understand each other. The only distinction I'm making is, in spite of all of the ill effects of a church policy or of shallow and vapid family members or employers that react badly because of maybe some church policy, in spite of all that, the victim in all this is, demanding and requiring validation from that group in order to be happy, in order to find peace. I think is maybe that will happen, but it probably won't, and it's a dead end path. And the whole point of the trauma and the whole point of all this pressure, I think, is to teach us to look within, or look to God, or look elsewhere for validation but besides some church or some family member or some employer. That's the only distinction that I think is important to be made.
Well, Jack, let me try and apply this with a hypothetical. When you are a member of a community who suddenly decides that everyone with the name Nanik is not a member or is not a true member of this society, and everyone who sees you with the last name Nanik, they see you as an outsider. You're exiled from the community. You said it yourself when we started this podcast that you take a great sense of community away from the church, and that keeps you coming back. Well, why else do we have communities if not to seek validation from those communities?
Well, why would I stay? I guess it begs the question then, why would I stay in a community that has set up to oppress me? I mean, no, it's a good question. I mean, I would rather be, let me finish up. I would rather be alone in the Sahara Desert than with a group of people who are oppressing me, right? And so if I'm staying with a group of people that are oppressing me and demanding from that group of people to validate me, in my view, it's healthier to just say, these people will never accept me. They will never validate me. So I can stay here and be alone, or I can go to the Sahara Desert, or I can find a new community, or I can figure out some other way of dealing with this, right?
So,
and I think what you're saying is that's unfair, and the community ought to be the kind of community that I want. But how the community is out of my control. Now, I go to church because I like to contribute to that community. I don't feel oppressed by the community. Even I don't agree with everything that goes on, but I don't feel oppressed by it. But if it ever gets to the point where I do, I'll go elsewhere, or I'll go be alone.
So I think what we're running into is a difference in beliefs system, because there are a number of people who are LGBTQ who believe that this is the one true church. And that old adage exists for a reason. You can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. It's because we're taught from a very young age to view everything in our life through the lens that the church puts on our heads. Yeah. We're taught to think about everything of how it's going to affect our eternity based on what the church tells us, based on their canonical dicta. And the reason why people are so frustrated when they leave is because this one thing, this one system that I was sold, that I believe in, is taught to me as being the one true church. It's a tautology. It is a totalitarian system where everything that happens is understood through how the church perceives it. And when somebody believes that is the church, that this is the one true church, and they are LGBTQ, and that church pushes them outside of the community in some way, and oppression is not just throwing stones at somebody. Oppression is a wide gradient of this massive spectrum of different, microaggressions, all the way up to throwing gay people off of buildings. So when people experience that, and they're going for that sense of community, but the community sees them as an outsider, I can understand where they may be frustrated, but still want to attend because it's the one true church. Yeah. And somebody who believes in this, that website, mormonandgay.lds.org, exists for people that experience what the church calls same-sex attraction. That's just gay. People experience that, and they say you can live a happy life by abstaining from acting on your sexual attraction. You can still live in a happy marriage. You're just fine. But people who are gay and forced into a marriage that is, not with somebody who they share an attraction with, they're not going to be happy. And the church is causing that discomfort in their life.
Well, I guess I would take, you've raised so many really interesting points. They're all really great, but there are a lot of them. So let me parse out a couple, and there may be others you want to cover. But the first one is, I guess I don't understand this idea of people who are oppressed by a group, yet believe that group is the one true group. And maybe it's because I just am not hung up with this one true path sort of stuff. And, one of my earlier podcasts, I talk about my father's experience in the LDS church, and he was very active, but he was never hung up with those sort of things either. And I think I'm a lot like he was.
And you're also privileged. You're not part of a group that's disparaged by the church.
Well, I don't know if you can say that about me or not. And I think also you're presuming that I've never felt any sort of isolation or had any experiences of being on the margin or somehow all. That I'm, but I certainly don't suffer. I don't have the experience of a gay member of our church who also believes the church is true. I mean, that type of cognitive dissonance, I can't imagine makes anyone feel good. I guess I have a hard time understanding why someone who is, if I were gay and the church came out and said all these, the church has come out and said all these things, I wouldn't be going, I guess I wouldn't be going to church. But I'm having a hard time empathizing.
Even if you believed it was the one true church?
I guess I would have a hard time. I guess I would be working through that process. How is it that the one true, and these are the sort of tensions, by the way, that I think life presents us. But, so how is it that the one true church could at the same time label me a certain way? And I think you got to come out. That tension is going to force a person in that particular dilemma, or in a, more generic dilemma that has that type of tension. The individual has to think through, wrestle with it, and come to some sort of conclusion beyond just the state of never-ending tension. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's what life is supposed to do to us. And we're supposed to come to some sort of, we're supposed to come to some sort of equilibrium that gives us peace on our own. And the church may or may not validate that ever. And then you just got to own how you ultimately decide. I guess that's what I'm talking about when I talk about demanding validation from the church. The church is not going to resolve that tension for you. You have to resolve that tension.
So let's bring in something else that we talked about into this before we finish. Before we hop off of this dead horse. When people are in, like you described, the first half life people, and they see things in black and white contrast, where they see the church is true, the world is filled with influences that are controlled by Satan trying to take me out of the church. When they see things in this simplistic black and white perspective without seeing all of the shades of gray that truly construct the world, and they see that the one true church, this shining light, this beacon of truth in the world, says that what they are, who they are from a nature and nurture perspective, who they've come to be, is wrong in some way. And that's where they get their entire sense of community. Do you kind of understand my perspective of seeing that it's valid to try and change the church, especially for people who can't find that second half of life validation outside of the church?
It is valid to try to change the church. Look, and I said with Bill Reel, and I'll say it with you, I think the church's position on homosexuality is completely unsustainable. I mean,
agreed.
There's just, and the question, should we teach our basics and our fundamentals differently in a more compassionate way? Does that curriculum need a total overhaul? The answer, in my view, is an unequivocal yes, without a doubt. I mean, I'm not defending the way that we're doing things at all. I think that the church needs a massive amount, and I think that people should chime in on that. And there should be a huge overhaul. Having said all that, I'm not going to base my own self-esteem or my own spiritual worthiness or my own worth to God as a creation based on some highly imperfect, at times corrupt institution. I mean, I'm just not going to. And so then some people say, well, why are you going at all? And I think the answer,
that's my next question.
Well, then the answer is where else am I going to find something better for me? There may be something better for someone else. And if they find it, they should go there. And I think God is fine with that. But for me, where else should I go? Should I go to the Catholic Church? Should I go to no church? I guess what I'm saying is I don't think the church is more imperfect than anything else in this world. In many ways, it's less imperfect than a lot of other things in the world. I just think it's an imperfect, broken, kooky place that we're living in. Sorry to cut you off.
No, I think this is good because obviously you don't agree with a lot of the things that the church says. And there may very well be another church out there that more aligns with your own morality, because obviously your morality comes into conflict with the various stances that the church takes on, whether it's on the history or LGBTQ issues or whatever the case is.
On some things, but there's a lot of things that I think the church does right.
Okay, so in this case, it seems to me an exercise in futility trying to reconcile this massive monolithic church and what they claim is truth versus what your own morality dictates. Jack, have you ever considered that maybe no church is true?
I've certainly have considered maybe there is no true church. I think where I come out now is that I think there's a massive amount of truth, and that there are lots of paths that lead to the same place. And so the question that I struggle with now, I actually don't struggle with, but the question that I think about, that I learn the most about from asking now is not, is there any true church, or is this the true church, or are all churches, or is there truth in all churches? The question that I learned the most from is, why has God put me on this path? What am I supposed to be doing and learning on the path that I am on? That, the family that I was born into, the area that I grew up, what are the takeaways? Why was that the right script for my life and what I needed to learn, during whatever time I have. And to me, that's a more enlightening question for me to ponder than some of these, should I go to some other church? Or is there, I don't know. It's too hard of not too hard, but it's just not a question that I'm thinking about right now. I've thought about those things in the past, wrestled with those things in the past.
And I think it's a tough question to wrestle with, Jack. Let me tell you.
It is a tough question. Yeah.
Let me just share a personal story with you. And this came when so I stopped attending the church when I was like about 16 years old, 17. And it was purely out of apathy. I didn't know the history. I didn't have any issue with the church's stances on anything because I didn't pay attention. I was just apathetic. I didn't care. I heard about the Prop 8 debacle.
Did you grow up in Utah? Where did you grow up in?
Yeah, I grew up in Utah, just north of Salt Lake.
Okay.
So I left around, 16, 17 years old, and it took me until I was about 20, 21 to start researching the history and start understanding it. And in that interim period, I just didn't care. Once I started researching it, that's when I became fascinated.
Yeah.
And when I started understanding what I used to believe in. And that's also when I began researching other religions at a very cursory level. I that's when I began reading the Quran and got a whole 5 surahs in before I said, this is a horrific, disgusting, and hateful, bigoted book. And I started researching just, like I said, at a cursory level, other world religions. Yeah. And then at the same time, I was also watching YouTube conspiracy theory videos and watching the History Channel's Ancient Aliens and really diving way down these rabbit holes that you can explore your entire life and never get to the bottom of. And I finally came to this realization. I was sitting on my couch, and my state of mind may have been altered. It was after I moved to Colorado, and I was thinking about all of these things, congregating together in my mind, like, all of these religions, all of these prophets, all of these visions that they have. All of these amazing manifestations, maybe, just maybe, all of them are true. All of them at some level, they all brought something to the table. All of them are true.
Or there's at least some truth in all of them.
Yes. And then it took me about 10 seconds to realize, but they are all in conflict at some level.
Yeah.
So maybe they aren't all true, but maybe they are all false. And that was the moment that I finally embraced the term atheism. And of course, agnosticism underlies atheism because agnosticism is a stance on you can't know. There's no way that we can know about God. Yeah. But atheism is just, I don't believe in a God. Out of the millions and millions of gods that have existed in people's minds, I don't believe in any of them, and I don't worship any of them because we don't need a God for this world to explain what exists in this world. And I think it just takes that one extra little step of saying, they may not all be true, but they can all be false for us all to understand that we are only moving through this world as dictates of our own morality. And that seems to explain things so much better to me. And it doesn't force me into this box where I have to reconcile belief in a church that claims completely fallacious things about their own history or about their own policies and still believe in my own morality. I don't have that cognitive dissonance. I don't have to reconcile those. I'm just a human being.
That's good.
So that's just my perspective. I wanted to share that.
I mean, you illustrate that. That's fascinating. And it's an example, I think, of someone who has said, I'm going to own what I believe. I'm going to own my own faith or lack of faith, or however I'm explaining, however I'm understanding life, I'm going to own it myself. I'm going to think about it and I'm going to own it. And, you and I can debate all day long about whether it's reasonable to believe one thing or the other thing. But for me, the most important thing is that you're not looking for the blessing of the church on how you've decided to live your life. And that's given you a certain amount of independence. It's also true. It's also and your sense of self is not wrapped up with Thomas S. Monson coming to you and saying, "Now, Bryce, good for you." You don't need that that validation. And I think that liberates you to talk about things in a more dispassionate way about church culture or things that need to be changed. And
that's also a product of my personality. I'm anti-authoritarian.
Yeah, but
from my
I think also it's a form of progress where you're evolved to the point where you can do that. And I think ultimately people need to stand on their own 2 feet. And I have a view too. People we're very afraid of atheism. Mm-hmm. We the LDS people, we're very afraid of. You got to always make yourself say that you believe certain things. And my own view is, I don't think God cares either way. Let's assume there is a God. I don't care. I don't think that he cares either way, or she, or whatever it is, about what anyone's particular view is at any given point in time. Eventually, we're all going to know what's what. And if God is not at least that flexible and compassionate, then why do we want to believe? Why do we want to worship him anyways? I mean, maybe he exists, but we don't want to worship him. And so I don't think anyone should be afraid of tackling questions, coming to conclusions, living with their conclusions for a while, revising later. I mean, I think that's the miracle of life on a general in a general way. But for me, inside Mormonism, that's one of the miracles of Mormonism, is that it gets reinvented every 20 years and completely reevaluated, and it doesn't happen as fast as people want. But if you look at the church the way it is today versus the way it was in 100 years ago, I mean, you wouldn't even recognize the church. It's so different. And so I like these sort of changes, and this kind of evolution. And I think that's the point. We're supposed to be grappling with things and experimenting with things and living with our conclusions for a while and see if they work. And then at some point we do have experience, and then we just know,
I guess where I personally take issue with this is that the church so often comes into conflict with social progress. Right. I mean,
for sure.
They gave race to people of African American descent. They gave the priesthood to people of African American descent, years after the civil rights movement began. Yeah. I mean, they are well behind history on the LGBTQ issues that they are currently fighting with. I mean,
yeah, and those are fair criticisms. I mean, they have not been a the tip of the spear for social change, for sure.
For what a church is supposed to be, the beacon of morality and what is supposed to dictate human morality, it seems really weird to me that our own human morality is being held back by the church.
I think it's in some ways, I would agree with that the churches or church members they seek they think they have a false sense of security, that a false sense of being morally correct in some aspects of their life when they're clearly not. I mean, we talked extensively about the gay community, but you could talk about environmental issues. You could talk about, pollution, capitalism. There's all sorts of things that, right-wing Republican Mormon type culture has a false sense of superiority about. Mm-hmm. And it just isn't, it could do better. It could change. It could, and I think it will over time. But there are other things that, I mean, the church does other things quite well. On balance, I'm not sure if the church is worse than alternatives. I don't know.
So I do have one other question scripted up here, but I think I'm going to ignore it in lieu of asking you one final question. Okay. And that is, Jack, what keeps you believing in the church?
What keeps me believing in the church? Well, I don't believe monolithically in the church. I think anyone who believes in the church has not given a rigorous enough answer to what they really believe, because you can't believe everything any organization espouses. So you really can't believe in the church or in the government or, or the Bible for that matter, because it's not a monolithic thing. There are all sorts of colors. There's all sorts of strands. There's all sorts of parts. And so maybe what you're asking is, why do I think it's a good place to go? What am I getting out of it? Why am I attending? I think the church does a nice job, at least where I've always lived. I've lived in the Midwest and on the East Coast. And where I've lived, the church does a really nice job of, and this is, you're not going to, now that I've spoken to you for an hour, I know you're not going to believe this, but the church does a nice job of accepting a lot of different kind of people, taking care of them, loving them, sort of allowing them to believe how they believe, accepting them at whatever stage they're at. And again, I've been in smaller, sort of heterodox, very diverse wards most of my life, where there's real range of economic situation. There's a real range of ethnicity. There's been a lot of diversity, real range in beliefs, a lot of converts. So there's a lot of, other beliefs that are kind of morphed in. And I think the church has always been this accepting, loving place where when you need something, people will help you. They'll give you things. And if you are in need of doing something for someone else, which is really great for the soul, you can go there and find somebody to do something for, and that's the other thing is, I think it does a nice job for our kids in general, not for all the kids, but for most of them, it does a nice job of protecting them from the big, life-altering dangers that can happen during one's teen years when you're incredibly reckless. And maybe the church goes too far. Maybe we don't strike the right balance. But I think overall, it's a safe place for most of the kids. Not all of them, but for most of them.
I think you qualified everything fairly well, and I think you know who you're talking to in this, and I think you can understand that I may take issue with quite a few things that you said, but we unfortunately do not have time for me to refute or to dive deeper into what you said, but obviously there's a lot couched in that, but I do want to ask one final question, and there may be a follow-up on this. Do you consider Joseph Smith to be a true prophet?
Let's see. I don't think that he is the infallible, sort of Hallmark card, Norman Rockwell type of archetype prophet that we portray him as. So was he a prophet in the sense that he received some guidance, some spiritual revelation? I think he did. Did everything that he claimed to have received spiritually, was everything that he said was revelation? Clearly it wasn't. I mean, I think polygamy was just I think it just was not inspired at all. So that's a fairly major one. But I think there's tons of other things that he said and did and said were revelation, said was from God, that weren't. I mean, there's even sections in our canonized scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants, predictions, prophecies that never came to pass.
Yeah.
So he's not he's not the Hallmark card, Norman Rockwell, standard of nobility that we portray him as.
Well, let me follow up on that. Can you have a true prophet that delivers false prophecies?
Oh, I think there's no doubt you can. And I think ultimately we're all seeking spirit. Well, maybe we're not, but in my own life, I'm seeking spiritual guidance. I'm seeking answers to prayers, and they're not all right. Not all the answers that I think are answers are answers. Yet there are times when I get answers that I really think that they're answers. They're unequivocally answers. And so there's no doubt that people can receive a guidance and inspiration, in my view, from beyond, from the divine, and be right maybe just a little more than half of the time, or maybe less than half the time, and be wrong a lot. I mean, there's no doubt that happens all the time. And I guess that's what I was saying earlier is how liberating it is to realize that, these guys that we have lauded as infallible, how liberating it is to learn that they're completely flawed people. So liberating, because then it takes a lot of pressure off of me personally. It gives me the ability, or at least gives me the right to judge according to what I think is right, what I hear.
Okay. Well, I guess let me just share with you before we call it a night what I see as a prophet, because I think the term prophet is obviously flawed in so many ways, because when you are a prophet and you say, "Thus saith the Lord," and whatever you claim that "Thus saith the Lord" doesn't happen, then that makes you a false prophet. And I don't think you can have a false prophet in a way, or a true prophet who delivers false prophecies. And especially one who doesn't even make it better than random chance when it comes to prophecies being fulfilled. So that being said, I want to share what I would define somebody as doing something prophetic, just by the sheer sake of them making a prediction, that prediction being fulfilled, and them whatever they predicted becoming true. Peter Higgs was an amazing mathematician and scientist. He made mathematical models that basically predicted the existence of a single particle inside of a specific other molecule. So they built the Large Hadron Collider, this massive multi-billion-dollar multinational science fair project, in order to see if they could prove or disprove his prediction. He made this what some may call prophecy, what scientists would call a prediction of the existence of this molecule. And they fired these protons around the Large Hadron Collider and fired them at each other at near light speed, and they exploded. And they found the Higgs boson particle. An amazing...
The God particle.
And erroneously labeled as the God particle, yes. Yeah, and it blew people's minds in some ways, but so many people were hoping that it would be disproven, that they would be able to learn more from the Higgs boson particle not existing. But, unfortunately for those people, it did exist. They observed it, and Peter Higgs was awarded the Nobel Prize for it. This is amazing. Making a scientific prediction that then is fulfilled, that is proved by the evidence, is what I consider to be the closest thing to a modern day prophet that we could possibly have. The thing is, Joseph Smith never made a scientific prediction. He never made a prediction about a historical occurrence. He never made a prediction of, I guess you could make an equivocation about the Civil War, him predicting the Civil War, but many people were. He never made any sort of claim that was testable scientifically, and many of the things that he did claim did not come true. And I don't see any value in any of his prophecies if he's, swinging worse than random chance. And in that case, I don't see any value in calling him a true prophet in any respect. I just see him as a guy who was out for his own needs, his own self-serving benefits, and he screwed a lot of people over, and polygamy was only one small aspect of all of the horrible things that Joseph Smith did to other people. And I don't think that's a person that we should venerate in our society.
Well, you make a lot of good points. I mean, I think you're entitled to your opinion, and I don't take issue with a whole lot that you said. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if you want me to. I'm not sure what you want me to say at this point, but
yeah, and the reason I said, I preface that by saying, let me just share my perspective, because that's the Joseph Smith that I see, and I cannot reconcile belief in him as a prophet. So I only do that so that I can create hopefully some empathy for you, Jack, so you can see where I'm coming from in this, because I've wanted to understand your system of beliefs and why you believe in the church at any level whatsoever. And I think all in all, this conversation has been very, very fruitful, and I've learned a lot about you, Jack. And all in all, I really, really want to thank you for coming on and for talking to me and for being an open book in talking about these things. This has been an amazing conversation.
Well, thanks for having me, and I hope that I've expressed empathy for your view. I think that, as I said, I believe that people people have to own their own views and think through them. And if one thing that's evident is that you've thought through things and you have wrestled with things and you've come to your conclusions. And I think that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be wrestling and coming to our own conclusions. And, and we're always, myself included, the way that we think, the way I think anyways, we're thinking the way we think today. And, we may think differently later. And I hope I think differently later because it'll mean that I've made a little progress. But I certainly, I think I understand and certainly respect your views and certainly grant you the right to hold them and to come to the conclusions that you come to.
Likewise, and I think the simple fact that we can come together and talk about some of these issues that you and I may disagree on, but we can see each other's morality and each other's life through each other's eyes, through this sense of empathy. I feel like this, all in all, this is how we grow and this is how we learn together instead of trying to draw a dividing line of
I agree with that.
One of us is apostate, the other is a TBM. We can't even talk to each other across that divide. That's we got to bridge these gaps. And obviously, we both have very nuanced perspectives of the church, and we've both thought through things quite a lot in order to arrive to those conclusions. And it sounds like both of us are subject to allow our thinking to be changed when given new evidence. And I think that is the right way to approach life.
And I agree. I think there's no sense in anyone, acting like, that they have all the truth. And no, I mean, we're a bunch of, there's a lot of people on earth with a lot of different point of views, and there's a lot of people who know a lot more than I do. So
yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I think there's nothing to be gained by not talking.
All right, awesome. And if people want to hear you talking more, where can they find you on social media and podcast feeds?
They can find me at Mormon Awakenings Podcast, which is distributed through MormonDiscussionPodcast.org. It's also on iTunes. And if you look up Mormon Awakenings, or if you look up Mormon Discussions, you'll find my podcast there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jack. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, Bryce. It's really been great talking. Really enjoyed it. Good deal.
I appreciate these amicable conversations like this. So thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, that does it for the conversation with Jack. Once again, I do want to thank him so much for coming on and joining us, and having a fairly long conversation about the church. But I feel like it wasn't long enough. Like, we could have taken a deep dive into so many of the things that were brought up, but we kept the thing moving, and we had a bit of a time constraint with our conversation. So he did say a few things that I want to respond to. He said at one point in today's conversation that the church gets reinvented every 20 years or so. But I guess my question would be, what about the people who suffer in the meantime between those reinventions? Every 20 years, I don't agree with his metric of reinvention or his time scale, but, every so often the church reinvents itself and completely shifts its stance on something, that's, politically relevant. Of course, the paramount example that it's coming to mind is, race in the priesthood. And I brought it up in the conversation. You listened to it. But what about the people who suffer in the meantime? And what about all of the African-American people who were members of the church and died without being able to receive the priesthood? By the church's line of logic, those people will still be in the state that they were in, prior to 1978. They are going to be, just like in Brigham Young's time, sealed as servants to people in heaven. They will be eternal slaves. So, and let's apply this to how the church treats LGBTQ people today. Let's say that the church in 2 years' time does finally allow for people who are in gay relationships to have the priesthood, and they do a complete about-face from their current stance, and people who are gay or who are trans or whatever the case may be are given the priesthood, full outright given the priesthood. And the only way to do this is by giving priesthood to the women as well. Let's say this happens in the next year or two. What about all of the people who were excised from the church because they were gay? What about all the people who feel like they don't belong in their community because the church was opposed to who they are? What about the people who died at a time when they weren't able to get the priesthood, but now suddenly they can get the priesthood? What if they died 2 weeks before the church made this stance change? They just don't get into heaven? Whereas everybody who dies after that of the LGBTQ community, they do get to go to the celestial kingdom? The thing is, this is not a tenable perspective, and it shows that the church is holding back our morality in many ways. This goes into something else that Jack said that I want to respond to. He said that the church accepts a lot of different kinds of people, and that the church takes care of them. But I would offer the caveat that can be the case if you fall into line, if you toe the party line, if you do what the church says and you aren't gay, right? The church does take care of people who are in need. That's why the church has an amazing welfare program. But it doesn't take care of everybody in need. And it doesn't offer the emotional and spiritual support that people need when they are not in line with what the church says. There are so many gay teens who are on the street, kicked out of their families' homes because they're gay. The church isn't taking care of them. Their communities and families aren't taking care of them. And them trying to seek validation is one way of them trying to shift the church's perspective and maybe try and work from the inside to get the church to not espouse bigotry that it currently does. I can see the value in trying to change the church from the inside for people, who are gay, people who don't agree with the church's stance, but still think that it's a true church or that it's a good community or whatever the case may be. So as far as that goes, at one point in the conversation, Jack also said he can't wrap his mind around people who are gay and believe in the church. But I think the point stands that people who are a member of the church are doing so more often than not because of the community. Even if they don't believe that it's true, they think, oh, it's a good way to raise children, or it's a good community, or all of my friends or all of my the people in my neighborhood go to church, and if I don't go, then I won't be part of this group of people. There are societal benefits for this, and of course there are secular mechanisms who are surpassing the usefulness for the community that the church offers, and those communities don't require massive changes in order to be more accepting. You can just go find a different Facebook group to be part of and unfollow somebody on Facebook you don't like. But the point is the church says that it's the one true church, right? And if you are gay, the church claims that you can't really be a full-on member, or that you if you are a kid growing up with gay parents, then you can't be a member of the church. Or if you are gay, you can't act on that. You can be a member of the church, you just can't be in a same-sex relationship. These are all damaging beliefs that the church holds, but there are people who are gay who believe in the church, which I can't understand either, because the church obviously doesn't understand them, and it doesn't offer to those people what it offers to people who aren't gay. So the church is, in my opinion, holding us back when it comes to these LGBTQ issues. It is coming in conflict with our human morality. And if you watch the John DeLynn TED Talk that he gave, he talks about himself coming into conflict with what the church claims about, gay people, about members of the LGBTQ community. And John basically says, well, I agreed with the church until I found out I had a gay friend. And then I realized that they're not evil. I mean, I'm of course paraphrasing, but that's essentially the main point of his TED Talk. And the church is obviously anathema to human morality in this case. And I think that is damaging in many aspects. And another point that Jack made is that the church protects children from big life-altering dangers that can happen during the teen years. I assume that means drugs and partying. Okay, this is an interesting point, and it's something that I can't wholly disagree with. I think Jack hit on a good point here. You know, I've seen a number of statistics that do back up the claim that children in Utah have a lower rate of consumption of drugs and alcohol than teens of the rest of America. I find that fascinating. And I have said multiple times on this podcast that I credit the church and my parents with giving me a good, solid upbringing. You know, I wasn't surrounded by drugs and alcohol. I didn't have to deal with those things. But it can also teach a perspective that is not healthy of these things. Okay, people drink, people do drugs, and teaching kids that those people or that those activities are unequivocally horrible and should be disparaged and they are from the devil, that's not healthy either. It creates taboos. You know, I'm aware of a number of people who I've talked to who have said, and this is purely anecdotal, take it for what it's worth, but who said that when they came out of the church, they went crazy with drugs and alcohol because these things were so taboo for so long. And then they jump into the real world at college or something like that. And these things are available, all day, every day, everywhere. And they go completely hog wild on it. That's not healthy either. And teaching a complete abstinence policy when it comes to drugs and alcohol, that works the same way as abstinence-only education works for, sex ed, right? It's something that it creates a stigma around these things that should not exist. It makes them taboo and interesting. You put a child in a room with only a big red button and tell them not to push that big red button. Eventually, they're going to push it. That's the thing. People eventually are going to come into contact with drugs and with alcohol, and teaching them that these are unequivocally evil instead of, teaching a real education of what drugs and alcohol do and what they are, and, maybe talking about some of these social aspects of drugs and alcohol and where these things are appropriate and where they aren't. Maybe that's a better conversation and a more worthwhile endeavor instead of just teaching abstinence only in these cases. So I don't know. I agree with Jack that the church does protect children from life-altering dangers, and I assume that he's alluding to drugs in that case and partying. But I don't think that the method that they use in order to protect children from these things is sustainable or intelligent, because it's just saying you can't do it because I say you can't do it. It doesn't actually create a nuanced and wise perspective in the minds of teenagers about these things. It just says they are evil, don't do them. When a kid does do them, they're going to hide it from their parents. They're not going to talk to people who need to know about these things when they eventually, inevitably get exposed to these things. So the thing is, whenever I get in a conversation with somebody like Jack, I feel like we can sit and examine every single line that each other says for hours and never get to anything substantive in the conversation. But I didn't feel that way with Jack. I felt like everything that we talked about, we could have explored for a number of minutes beyond just what we said. And I really hope that in the future, he and I can re-engage and continue having these conversations, because I think it is, as I said at the interview, I think it's a fruitful endeavor to bridge the gap of belief to non-belief and have these conversations. Just saying, oh, they're a TBM, they believe in stupid stuff, or just saying, oh, they're an atheist, they don't understand the church. Having these antiquated or ignorant perspectives of each other doesn't do either of us a service. It just creates stigmas where stigmas don't exist. And I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to have these conversations. And all of that being said, I can continue talking on so many things that came up in the conversation with Jack, but I would prefer to do so when I'm actually talking to him, on air or face to face or whatever the case may be. So I want to thank Jack one more time for coming on and joining us and having this conversation. And I thoroughly hope that we can continue the conversation elsewhere at a later time. Looks like we have a couple of new patrons to thank. We have Vania, and Randy. Thank you both so much for pledging to support at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. I hope you enjoy the extra content that you get over on that feed. And, of course, a huge thanks to all of the patrons who support the show and keep the lights on here at Ground Gnome Studios. And, yeah, your support is deeply appreciated, and you make this all possible. Thank you. Let's go ahead and button things up for the evening. I do want to let you guys know I was recently on the Holy Crap, the Vlogcast. That's just a live YouTube broadcast that airs every week with a bunch of people, including my good friend Deb, Heretic Woman from Beyond the Trailer Park, as well as somebody who I met at this last ReasonCon, the good old infamous, one or the other, Shujin Tribble. He's the primary host of the Holy Crap Vlogcast, and it was a whole panel of a bunch of interesting people. We had a lot of good conversation, so check the show notes for a link to that YouTube video of Holy Crap, the Vlogcast. And with that, I hope you will permit me a moment to thank the people who keep this show going on the back end. Thank you so much to Julie for running the Twitter and Facebook pages and being a general social media guru. Thank you so much, Julie. You are awesome. Thank you so much to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to see more of his music there. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast for providing the legal counsel in this show. Be sure to check out my other half show, My Book of Mormon podcast, where we read through the Doctrine and Covenants with Marie Kent. It's such a pleasure to be her co-host. But most importantly, I have to thank all of the inspiringly wonderful listeners out there. I keep telling people I have the best listening audience in the world, and nobody has posed a single argument that would convince me otherwise, and I don't think that argument exists. So thank you so much once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.